Our guest on This is America in the World is Bill Kristol, a well-known political commentator and advisor. He's the co-founder and an editor-at-large of the political opinion and analysis website, The Bulwark. Previously, he was co-founder and editor of the Weekly Standard and served as a senior staff member in both the Reagan and Bush presidential administrations. Bill, so terrific to be with you once again and today.
Great to be with you.
When you look at America today, we got some time on kind of a longer format and long form program. When you look at America today, what do you see?
I mean, it's not entirely a happy story. Maybe we should begin, though, with the happier parts. We, had a pandemic that we didn't handle very well at first, I think. The Trump administration deserves some blame for that. And the Biden administration has made some mistakes. On the other hand, we have a vaccine, and it's fairly miraculous, and it's every American who's wanted it has been able to get it, and a lot of other people around the world, thanks to, in part, our own business, pharmaceutical companies and the spirit of innovation, which remains in science and which remains strong in America. We've got something like 4% unemployment right now, which I think if you had told us a year and a half ago, after all the shocks of the pandemic, we wouldn't have a little inflation, but that's in a way produced by people, wages going up. So it's not entirely a bad thing. So for all the doom and gloom about America, one can make a case that the society underlying the economy, the society, the spirit of innovation, the scientific knowledge, that's all pretty strong. The politics are pretty broken, though.
So let's focus in on Washington, D.C. And when you say the politics are broken, talk a little bit about that. How broke is it?
I mean, it's pretty broke, and it's more broke than it was 5, 6, 7 years ago, I would say. If we were having this conversation, maybe we did have this conversation, Dennis, 5, 6, 7 years ago, we would have, I think, correctly been worried about partisanship, even hyper-partisanship, people not getting together to solve problems, gridlock, and a certain kind of extremism, perhaps, of rhetoric and of political views. But we would not be in the situation we are now after Donald Trump, after a 4-year Trump presidency, after his reshaping of the Republican Party and everything that's done to our political discourse and our politics simply. And so one way to think about it is we've gone from partisanship, which maybe started to pick up 20, 30 years ago, to hyper-partisanship. That might have been the situation 6, 7, 8 years ago. On the Hill, Ted Cruz shutting down the government, John Boehner being deposed, the fights over the judges. Bad, but still not fatal. We've gone from hyper-partisanship to polarization and what the political scientists, social scientists call affective polarization, which is the whole society now is much more polarized than it was. It's not just a Washington problem. I think it started mostly as a Washington problem, honestly, but it's now become a national problem. And the polarization isn't just different ways of life. There are people who go to church and people who don't. They're side by side. They don't fully understand each other. But now it's not just they don't understand each other or even have a certain disdain for each other. They kind of hate each other, at least to some degree. I don't know if the people hate each other, but enough leaders of the different groups hate each other that it spills down, I'm afraid, to the society as a whole.
But so you put hate on the table, and there's a kind of a meanness, there's an anger out there, and even now violence, huh?
And the threat of political violence is really something pretty new for most of our lifetimes. I mean, we've had assassinations, we've had terrible things happen, but riots occasionally, but this kind of systemic use of violence. And I do want to say this as a Republican, a former Republican, it's not even-handed, the blame on this. There is blame everywhere, as there often is, but the polarization, the resort to violence, the real extremism, demonization of your opponents, denigration of everyone on the other side is not just incorrect or maybe even having dangerous ideas, but purposely wanting to destroy America. That's mostly from Republicans. It's mostly from Republicans in the era of Donald Trump. And the great disappointment of the last year, Dennis, for me and for many others, is that one could have hoped reasonably, I was never that optimistic, but hoped reasonably that after Donald Trump lost and left office, some of this would fade away. There'd be a bit of a turn, a bit of a return to a healthier politics. but that's not happened. And that, I think, that if you had said on November 4th to us, to me, that, it would be even more polarized today, and the Republican Party would be, if anything, more irresponsible in some ways than it was a year ago, without the excuse of having to cater to an incumbent Republican president, as Donald Trump was then. And if you'd said to me on January 7th, after what happened, there wouldn't be any lessons learned, there wouldn't be any rethinking, that now the Republicans would be moving towards a kind of defense or whitewashing of January 7th, that's really bad. So in that respect, it's asymmetric, as the political scientists say. The Democrats have plenty to answer for, the left has plenty to answer for, but the current problems come mostly, I think, and fundamentally from the right.
I want to get this in before we take a little break at the open here for our underwriters. Democrats, they seem to be devouring each other, the left, far left, and the center. So you got this going on in the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party, it just has become the party of Trump. So both parties are way off their original mandates, their original missions, their original framework. Huh?
I think it's really true of the Republican Party, with the exception of Liz Cheney. But look how alone she is. That photo of on January 6th of Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney on the floor of the House, I guess it was, with no one else with them on the Republican side, it really was telling. And the Democrats, I think, are complicated. I was very pleased that Joe Biden was the Democratic nominee in 2020, not Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. Not that they're not decent people who wish the country well, but I think there's more of a chance, there was more of a chance, it is more of a chance in a Biden Democratic Party to reach across the aisle, to build a kind of coalition of pro-democratic forces, which would include some Republicans or some ex-Republicans. Pete Buttigieg had this nice phrase during the campaign, future former Republicans. He said he wanted to appeal to them. And I resonate to that. A friend of mine said to me the other day, you can't be a future former Republican forever, though. You got to sort of, but for now, I think I can be. And I think the Biden administration has done some outreach, and members of Congress have, and Democratic governors, some of them are governing in a pretty centrist way. But yeah, there hasn't really been a more systematic attempt to say, wait a second, we're now creating a big tent Democratic Party where we're not going to change our fundamental views. People have to, I'm joining, people like me are joining them. They're not joining me, they're the predominant number. But we're sort of making an affirmative effort to really be the party that stands for democracy and to bring in all the people unhappy about the way the Republican Party has gone. I think the Democratic Party could do much more in that vein.
If you had a form in front of you and it said Democrat or Republican, would you check the Democratic box?
For this election and for the likely next two or three, I just think this is not a Republican Party that can be trusted to hold power.
Let's take a little break. Talking with Bill Kristol, editor-at-large at the Bulwark. We're going to talk about the Bulwark and find out what that's all about. A veteran of both the Bush and the Reagan administrations, and political commentator, seen very frequently, we're happy to say, on MSNBC. Take a little break. Back on the other side. This is America and the World. Underwriting for This is America and the World is made possible by the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., the Republic of Uzbekistan, the Sultanate of Oman, the Kingdom of Morocco, the National Association for Children of Addiction, Faces and Voices of Recovery, the Forerunner Foundation, the Rotendaro Family Trust, and the Embassy Series, Uniting People Through Musical Diplomacy. Bill, there seem to be three major stories playing around. Voting rights, the big lie, and the death of democracy. You want to tackle one of them and just grab whichever one you want to go with? I suppose, a lot of writing now about the death of democracy.
Well, but they're all related, right? I mean, one piece of evidence for the possible death of democracy, and one thing that would contribute to it, is the big lie. one way to deal with a big lie, to cushion it, you might say, to prevent it having the worst consequences, is to make sure voting rights are secure across the country, that election subversion isn't possible, and so forth. So these are very related. But I think what it does come down to is the degree to which we had a Trump administration that was willing to challenge, let's just say, the guardrails that have been accepted a long time in terms of the rule of law and sort of businesses, certain institutional constraints, certain norms that weren't written down perhaps, but that were how presidents behaved, how political parties behaved. A lot of that was tested and weakened, I would say. I do think the challenge to the election, though, based on nothing, based on no facts, totally made up big lie, and then the willingness to propagate that and the willingness of others to go along with it. Then January 6th, the violence, but also the fact that 147, I think it was, House Republicans voted based on nothing, to overturn, no plausible evidence, no plausible facts, no plausible legal argument, actually, to overturn the votes of the citizens of Arizona and then Pennsylvania. I mean, that really is a kind of a threat to democracy and a willingness to just ignore the normal constraints that make democracy possible. If you lose the election, you hand over power. And in a healthy democracy, you hand over power somewhat gracefully. And in a very healthy democracy, you help the people coming in as they assume power. And that's happened recently. Barack Obama was very unhappy to be succeeded by Donald Trump, but there was no complaining. They tried to cooperate with the Trump incoming team as much as possible. It's a little more difficult than the normal situation. 8 years before that, there'd been total cooperation between the Bush people and the Obama people and graciousness. It's interesting, the other day, someone on Twitter mentioned a clip and I went and looked at it. Richard Nixon in 1961. Nixon, a pretty partisan politician who later had his own challenges as president in terms of threats to democracy to some degree, certainly to law-abidingness. Richard Nixon presides over the Senate, over Congress, when they count the electoral votes in 1961, because he's the vice president, of course. And he announces his own defeat, which is the first time I think that's happened in a century, he says. And then he, in that old-fashioned way, he says, I'd like to ask the speaker if I could just take a minute for personal privilege to make some remarks. And he speaks for maybe a minute and a half, and very eloquent, plainly and simply, but eloquently, that it's an honor for him to preside at this ceremony. This is the American way. This is the democratic way. This is what makes American democracy great. That there's a peaceful transfer of power and one might almost say a courteous transfer of power. And that was, I was alive then. I was a little kid then, but I was alive then. That wasn't totally another era, or it shouldn't be, and it shouldn't be something that we're incapable of. But right now, I do think our politics make it very hard to see that happening. And so we're looking at an election in 2024, where the Republicans are sort of trying to lay the predicate for possibly overturning the votes in several states, where the public believes in a big lie. And one interesting thing, and I'll close with this, is that it turns out once you kind of spread big lies that are not based on facts and that are lies and pretty shameless lies, in one area, it's a little hard to control it, right? I do think there's a kind of weird connection between the lies about the election, about democracy, and the lies about the vaccine, for example. That somehow once you have this kind of, once conspiracy theory, because when you think about the lie about the election, what does it depend on? Massive conspiracies, tens of thousands of election workers in different states suddenly deciding to hide ballots or destroy ballots or allow ballots to be destroyed. And when you think about it for a minute, how it would work in practice, right? It's a pretty massive conspiracy, as it would have to be to, I guess, make up, results about vaccines or whatever. And believing in one conspiracy makes it easier to believe in another. And belief in conspiracies is very unhealthy for a body politic.
The Associated Press, and this is just off the top of my head, just released some report about the last vote, the 2020 vote, and they found in several key states, adding up to about 300 or 400,000 votes, they found 400 votes that were questionable in some way, shape, or form. Some people making mistakes, honest mistakes. A couple of people voting twice or something like that. But the percentage was like 0.01 of all of the votes cast in these half a dozen key states. But help me understand this, because I can't. There were court cases. There were phone calls. The Attorney General came out, Attorney General Barr came out and said, not fraud that would change the election in any way, shape, or form. There was the whole thing with Mike Pence, trying to get him to decertify, and then culminating in January 6th. I don't understand how people can say there wasn't any fraud. I mean, there really wasn't any fraud. And I just sit back on a daily basis and say, how can this big lie get going and be supported by so many people?
I mean, I think there are a lot of things going on. I do think the Trump presidency was important in laying the groundwork. You had a president of the United States telling a bunch of lies for 4 years, getting people worked up about them, making it a matter of party loyalty, not to contradict him. So when he started telling the election lie, which he did before the election, of course, Republicans mostly took a kind of, oh, well, look, he's probably going to lose. At that point, no one cares about any of this. We don't have to go out of our way in the middle of an election campaign in September or October to contradict Donald Trump. So they didn't. Then between November 3rd and January 6th, you remember this too. I mean, people being quoted in the paper, well, he's popping off, but it doesn't matter, And he made a couple of calls to people, inappropriate, but, he'll be out of office. Then January 6th happened, a day of kind of seriousness. And then quickly, he's leaving. Why bother voting to impeach him now? And certainly why bother voting to convict him? And it turned out that each of these stages of accommodation were opportunities. It's hard to know how much difference they would have made if people had taken them. But for an awful lot of Republican leaders, Republican elected officials, conservative opinion journalists, conservative leaders, conservatives of certain previous administrations, to really step up, I think it would have made some difference. I think if you're a voter out there, maybe you want to believe Trump, you voted for Trump, you don't like the liberal media, you're reading some wacky stuff on some websites. But if every single other person you voted for governor, for senator, for Congress, previous presidents, you might have issues with some of them, the conservatives you respect are saying, no, look, and this is not the case. The election was fair, and these are the votes, and we need to get beyond this. I think we'd be in a different place now. So it was the accommodation, to my mind, of the elites, Republican and conservative, of Trump. Plus Fox News played a big role. That's something we haven't had much of, in that a whole network pushing this. And then plus social media, where you do get this possibility to have a kind of silos of conspiracy theories that people can get really into and exchange emails about, and websites, and then people make money off it, and there are a bunch of grifters around, and we have a whole ecosystem now. And I think honestly, people like me didn't fully appreciate how big it is, how profitable it is for people, how many people are in it, how much it can be all consuming. And we kind of assume that, as you say, well, if the court, 60 judges was to say this, and if even Mike Pence does it, come on, who's going to really, Bill Barr doesn't go along. I mean, it's really going to be a small percentage. I do think in a pre-social media, pre-Fox environment, it might have been a smaller percentage. Then maybe you're talking about 10 or 15%, 20% of the Republican Party, not 50, 60, 70% being swept up into this conspiracy network, so to speak.
I'm not a journalist, I'm an interviewer, but a couple of things I'm going to throw in your lap and help me understand. The people sitting in Congress on both sides of the aisle, and talking specifically about people who are supporting the quote unquote big lie, or the fact that the election was stolen, they all grew up in families. They all had parents, and parents talked about, values or religion or ethics, or, you're supposed to do things one way or the other. I can't understand. I mean, if you took Christian, Catholic, Islam, Jewish, whatever, I can't understand. I mean, you grew up in a Jewish family. I mean, your folks had values and ethics, and how do these people, and I shouldn't say these people, that's a little harsh. So when the son comes home 2 hours late, they're supposed to be in at 12 and they come in at 2. And they say, oh, Dad, we ran out of gas. Or the daughter is running for student council president, and she loses by 20 votes. How do they handle that at home with the same set of values that is supporting that the election was stolen? I can't get it. I can't wrap my arms around it.
I mean, it's a good question, Dennis, and I'm not sure there's any one answer. I mean, I think there are people who know that it's a lie, and they're grifters, and they're liars, and
now, do you know people who are either in the Congress or in the Senate who do know and do say, of course?
Oh yeah, no, I think at the leadership level, people, it's a matter of politics, of power, of money in many cases, of just thinking, well, I can tolerate this lie for a while. It's part of it'll go away eventually. Trump will go away, and we'll be in a stronger position by keeping our coalition together. I think among a lot of regular people, if I can put it that way, who've been sucked into it, they believe it though, and they've talked themselves into believing it. That's again, I'm not sure that would have been as easy to do, but look, God knows we've seen leaders talk whole nations into lies in the past, and people who otherwise were decent people with families and who wouldn't have dreamt of doing stuff at home once suddenly get swept up into something. I do think the degree to which Trump coarsened everyone's rhetoric and belief system almost over the last 5 years is a large part of it. I mean, he taught people, don't trust anyone who's not already on your side. Don't trust anyone who's not 100% on your side. They're lying to you. They're exploiting you. They're taking advantage of you. And if you think about it in a human way, people who feel aggrieved, who feel exploited, even if they sometimes are incidentally have reasons for complaint, they start to believe, you know what, they're all after me, so to speak, right? And so I think people can be sort of decent in their personal lives, but then look out at the country and believe things that, frankly, it's hard for me to believe they believe, but they do. And you'd think they put the two together, but they don't. That's what, again, it strikes me. People live their lives, they go to their jobs, they function fine at the corporate office, and then they come home and believe that the entire National Institutes for Health and Center for Disease Control and Congress and public health officials, they're purposely lying. I mean, why? But they're purposely lying about vaccines. It's almost incredible to think that you can, but then they go back to work and they function fine in whatever corporate office, they work in. It is, but I think we've seen that in other societies. We didn't expect to see that in the US.
75 million people voted for Donald Trump. 75 million. To use a phrase made famous by President Trump, there are good people on both sides, huh? They have some legitimate complaints. They have legitimate concerns. He became a very attractive candidate. Who are they?
Well, we know a lot about who they are, obviously, and they're a cross-section of the country. They were a slightly different cross-section than the Biden voters, but it's a bit of a myth that they're all, rural working class whites or something like that. I mean, there are plenty of college-educated people who voted for Trump, and a lot of people did so for different reasons. And I think a lot of people did so they rationalized what they didn't like about Trump. I think here, a lot of people, but let's say two things. There's certain types of people, and I've been distressed by this, but I think one has to be honest about it, who liked the being angry, who liked sticking it to other people, felt they'd been on the short end of the stick. They'd been condescended to, they'd been lectured, maybe their kids hadn't had an opportunity they thought they should have had somewhere, and now they're sticking it back at this liberal establishment that they think has taken advantage of them or not been respectful of them or something. So I think there's a certain amount of, this is where I think a lot of the media were wrong. I think, well, Trump's going too far here, or the people be turned off by this part of it. It turned out, unfortunately, people weren't turned off by some of the worst parts of Trumpism. They almost felt a kind of inner liberation and attraction. And I think, again, one knows this in life, right? There are times, unfortunately, it's kind of Lord of the Flies thing, right? The bullies get support from other people because there's a certain pleasure most of us repress, hopefully, and have repressed for most of our lives in bullying and in demonizing. But Trump was very clever, and as a demagogue, I'd say, in liberating that. And people turned out they liked being part of this movement that was sticking it to the other side, and they didn't care about the lies or the extremism of the statements. There's a whole nother slice of people who rationalized their support for Trump, though, and it was, it's important to have good judges. It's important not to let the Democrats into power. They're going to ruin the economy or whatever. And we just have to put up with this other stuff. So it's sort of like you have a good, I don't know, a good product, or you have a good you have relatives whom you don't care for a lot of what they do, but they're on your side, and that's your family, your team, and it's better to have them running things than these other people who you've been told over and over hate you. The idea that Joe Biden hates middle America is a little crazy to me, but then it's not Joe Biden, right? He's just the front man for Vice President Harris. It's not really Vice President Harris, it's really AOC. It's not really AOC, it's a bunch of dark forces promoting critical race theory in our schools.
For information about This Is America in the World, visit our website, thisisamericatv.net, or our YouTube channel, This Is America TV, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Underwriting for This Is America in the World is made possible by the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., the Republic of Uzbekistan, the Sultanate of Oman, the Kingdom of Morocco, the National Association for Children of Addiction, Faces and Voices of Recovery, the Forerunner Foundation, the Rotendaro Family Trust, and the Embassy Series, Uniting People Through Musical Diplomacy.